Now, okay. So yes, Gregor, as I was saying, thank you very much for taking the time to be available to have a chat to us about some topics really related to our project. We've spoken to a number of experts and eminent people during the last couple of years of the project about various topics to do with mistake making, and we sent you some material which you may or may not have had time to look at, or maybe just skim over, just to get a feel for what it is that we work on. But I thought I'd just do a quick introduction as we go around. So I'm David, and I'm the PI on the Mistakes in Living Systems project, and this is part of a John Templeton Foundation global research program on teleology and purpose and function and goals and all that sort of thing. And I think I'll go clockwise. Jonathan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, Jonathan Hill. I'm a medically trained psychiatrist, coming at this for a long time from the point of view of biology and mind, and understanding processes in biology as crucial to getting back to mind, as it were.
And then Francois?
So I'm a postdoc. My background is in computational neuroscience. I did models of reinforcement learning and dopamine. And in this project, I'm working on a model of blood clotting.
And Christopher.
Hi, I'm Christopher. I'm a philosopher, a postdoc in the project. My background is in metaphysics, but also philosophy of science, and particularly evolutionary developmental biology.
And Gregor, do you want to maybe just take a couple of minutes to talk to us a little bit about your current and past research and your kind of main interests and trajectories that you're on, and as far as your own areas are concerned?
Great. Thanks. So nice to meet you all. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure. I'm a postdoc at the moment at the University of Vienna in a philosophy of science group of Taya Knutila. And I also have a double background in molecular biology besides my philosophy degree. So that's why specializing in philosophy of biology was kind of a natural thing to do for me. And I would say the red thread connecting my research from my PhD until this day is a bit of an obsession with the structure-function relationship, which I looked at in my PhD thesis on the protein level mostly. But I can also see the topic of structure and especially function popping up all over the place. And your project is a really refreshing take on bringing these topics back to the forefront of biological reasoning in a very applicable way. But we'll come on all that details later. I did my first postdoc in Bordeaux with the group of Thomas Pradeux, and there I was intimately introduced with immunology, and that's maybe why I'm here tonight to talk a bit about immunology. But I also have a couple other ideas when I read the two papers you sent me, where I think it really shifted a bit my perspective to always have at the back of my head, I think, how could I frame this in terms of a mistake? How would that fit the purpose? And I think that's a very nice framework to have for a lot of applications, and that's very exciting. The postdoc I'm doing right now in Vienna is also part of an ERC project deemed Possible Life, where Taya Knutila is the PI, and there is also a connection to look at possibility spaces of like how proteins fold, what kind of trajectories or constraints in biology exist. So I'm very excited to hear about the project you're pursuing there, and reading it was really a refreshing take for dealing with a bunch of topics. And so I'm very excited to talk with you tonight.
Well, thank you, Gregor. That's a great summary of your own work and interest. And actually, because you have a lot of interests and kind of areas of work there, we are more than happy to take the conversation in any direction that might be useful, even relevant to your own other interests, apart from specifically immunology. So that's something that would like to focus on, but we can talk about anything that may have captured your attention reading our own things. And I just wanted, before I continue, just to allow Ingo, who's just popped in, to introduce himself as well. Ingo.
Well, hi there. Sorry that I'm a bit late. Yeah, Ingo, I don't know what you all said. I'm a physicist by training. Then I did computational neuroscience now for almost 20 years, and I'm moving over into more generalized biological modeling. So I'm mostly a modeler guy, applied mathematician, theoretical physicist type of person.
Great.
Great. Nice to meet you.
Yep, great, excellent. So that's a good start. We all kind of know what each other is working on, and what our interests are, and how they dovetail potentially with yours. And I guess, as I said before, yeah, what brought us to you was a chain of, speaking to various people about the immune system. So I'm just going to kick off, and this is all very informal and unstructured. I'm just going to throw some things out here and just say, well, we're interested in mistakes because of the way they tie into broader questions to do with goal-directedness, purpose, function, and even more broadly, what is called biological normativity. And I guess one thing that has kind of surprised us, I'm not going to necessarily speak on behalf of everyone here, but one thing that has surprised me, at least, is the extent to which, when people encounter what we've been doing, they use terms like refreshing and so on. And we've thought of our work as new and refreshing, but I was a bit taken aback by how different it seems to people who work perpetually on philosophy of biology and seem to have kind of banished talk of normativity from their way of thinking, or they want to reduce it, or they want to eliminate it, or they want to try and just do it all in terms of causal mechanisms and so on. And they encounter mistakes. They think, well, how can that possibly fit in? That's a normative idea. It's a human-centric idea. And how can an animal make a mistake? How can a cell make a mistake? And so they see it as kind of refreshing in that way as well, which is kind of a little bit surprising, because I guess for myself, at least, working in the neo-Aristotelian tradition, it's kind of currency for me. It's normal currency to talk in this way about normativity. So one of the things that we're interested in is immunity, and we mention examples in our papers of ways in which it might be possible for the immune system to be involved in mistake making. So it's not just an animal that might make a mistake, like catching the wrong kind of prey, or mislocating where it hid something, or not being able to build a very stable shelter or nest or something. But there can be systems and subsystems even at the cellular level, and maybe even at the protein level, which is something that we've just touched on a little bit in what we've written, where there might be mistake making at play as well. And in immunity, we're constantly struck by normative language, like, antibodies being sort of fooled or deceived into allowing a pathogen into the system that then wreaks havoc, or, making correct or incorrect discriminations between different kinds of object as to whether it's friend or foe, that kind of thing. And that kind of language is very congenial to the mistake kind of framework. But we're not experts on that. None of us are immunologists. We speculate, we look at the literature and come up with examples that we find. But it would be great to hear from you as someone with a more specialized interest to tell us, this is all metaphorical. It's not literal talk of mistakes. It's not literal talk of errors or failures to discriminate or whatever. Or maybe it is literal. And if it is literal, how are you supposed to understand an antibody making a mistake? So let me just throw a few things out there for you to react to if you'd like.
Yeah, fascinating. Thanks so much. Yeah, indeed, the metaphorical language is one of the big problems in immunology, and the struggle with some of the main concepts. So there's a lot of conceptual work and theoretical problems in immunology, which makes it so difficult, but also so interesting. And maybe one of the areas of biology where philosophical, theoretical contribution can ultimately also be a scientific contribution for changing how the scientists will think about these things. But the main component, I think, there was where I thought, oh yeah, sounds very much like what is very central in immunology in your papers was this capacity to like discriminate between what is like the correct way in which something should operate or act and the mistake side. And the discrimination criterion in immunology has by default, like the standard view, been that there is something like the ability to discriminate between self and non-self, which is problematic for a number of reasons, which was then a bit modified by Polymatzinger's idea of discriminating between being dangerous and not dangerous. And there's more recent ones. So Thomas Bradeux, for example, his discontinuity theory is about discriminating, like detecting rapid changes, and this would be what the immune system reacts to. So in the case standard cases of like the antibody antigen binding, where this talk of like fooling or escaping the host, like the pathogen would escape the immune system, I have a lot of question marks and would probably put it more on the metaphorical side. But I think there is a very good way to frame this maybe as a different way of mistake making, when this is one puzzle stone in a larger mechanism where the antigen binding or the absence of the binding will then trigger a cascade to trigger a response that is appropriate or not appropriate for a potential threat or a harmless substance being interacting with the organism. And then not having this response or having this response could be really justifiably be sorted into either category of either being a mistake or not a mistake. And something that I would have really liked to see explored deeper at some point, or maybe doing it myself at some point, would be to apply the idea of a signaling game to immunology here, where you basically have two agents, one a sender, one a receiver, and the sender kind of observes states of the world, like what is going on around me, like as the host organism, are there threats, are there dangers, is there something going on? And then it would send a signal to the receiver, another system, other components that would react, and then either remove a threat, repair damage, and so on, what the immune system could be doing. And there, I think it would really be very appropriate to say there could be a mistake in the observer part, the sender part, that misperceives something as a threat that is completely harmless, or reacts to its own body tissue, like it flags the symbol, cries for defensive measures when there is no need. That would, I think, fit your definition of a mistake. And on the receiver end, you could have the same also, that even without receiving a signal, it would trigger a response, or even there is a signal, it should respond, but it fails to do so. That probably these actions or inactions then would fall within this definition of mistake making here. Whereas just simple antibody binding, I'm not quite so sure. Like this metaphorical descriptions there are so ubiquitous in immunology. So I'm sure we can find examples of people saying exactly that. And also there's the rational meaning behind it to be extracted. But I would find these like more sender-receiver signal systems like the more prime candidates, where I see the connection here to the notion of a mistake.
Can I just jump just very
makes sense at all?
Absolutely, it does make a lot of sense. And actually, just to say quickly, when you mentioned about sender receiver, this is just a kind of a theoretical model, or is this something which is kind of being empirically tested in terms of actual senders and receivers?
There's a lot of game theorists working on that. So this model is used in like language learning, and people at UC Irvine used it extensively. That's why I'm a bit familiar with that from my research stay there. But in immunology, I'm not aware that this has ever been done to apply the notion of signaling games to immunology.
So I just wanted to say that
but whenever I speak to...
Yeah, sorry, carry on.
I was just saying, whenever I speak to immunologists and describe it like that, they, like at least one of them said, yeah, that's a very good way to frame it.
Well, can I just say, no, it rang a bell with me, because one paper that we've cited in our own work and which struck me when I read it was a paper about cellular decision-making, And it was based on the idea of what the authors are calling false alarm events and miss events. So a false alarm event is when a cell is activated in response to a particular signal, when the wrong signal, so it will release, some sort of molecule in response to some apparent danger, like a tumor, for example. When actually the signal, that's not the right signal, so it's a kind of a false alarm. And the alternative to that they talk about is what they call a miss event, where it fails to signal when it fails to warn the system or to release, the particular molecule when the threat is there. So it misses the threat, or it responds to the wrong kind of thing. So, which is what you said about the receiver, failing or responding when they shouldn't, or the sender responding when they shouldn't, or the receiver not responding when they should. And I'm just wondering, that might be a kind of model that carries across various. It's a kind of mistake. Those are both mistakes, and maybe they carry across in a nice way, both to immunity and to also other kinds of systems. So that just completely struck a chord.
Sure, I think for many kind of signal mechanisms, I think this should be very applicable.
Yeah.
And in immunology, things are kind of stuck a bit on this mainstream idea that it's all about the defense against pathogens, but then we would consider something as a mistake, like when we have autoimmunity or other reactions. I think from it's our perspective to say that it would discriminate between non and self, but probably it's a bit more general. It might react to some molecular patterns that are characteristic for some pathogens, for damaged cells, or just here is something going on that we are not able to recognize, like the immune system, the sender part is not capable of dealing with. It's a new thing, or it's rapidly changing, and that triggers an alarm. And so there's a lot of conceptual shift there. What could be the appropriate state of affairs that would require a signal to be made? And so I think it would be difficult to have a consensus. What are the correct and the mistaken state of affairs for triggering signals and the appropriate responses?
Ingo, you've got your hand up.
Of course, muting. So I just wonder if you're with this signaling language, you're not trying to somehow borrow intentionality. Like if you have a signal, there's a red or green traffic light, and you run the red light, then you're doing a mistake, and that's because the person putting up the traffic light had the intention that you stop at the red, and so and go at the green. So there is an intention, and you misread the intention, so you have your mistake there. I'm just wondering if you kind of like with positing a signaler, and you kind of positing this intentionality but I'm not. In some sense, we don't really need intentionality like that. A mistake, because referring back to what you said earlier about the people going a bit more general between self and non-self to dangerous. I immediately picked up and said, dangerous to what exactly? What is being in danger here? And if you kind of define everything in terms of what is being endangered, namely, in this case, the thriving of the organism you're looking at that has the immune system in some sense, then you don't really need to define a mistake in terms of somebody signaling an intent or something. The mistake is either, avoiding the danger or not. That's already enough of a judgment, right? So we're not necessarily all I'm trying to say is you don't necessarily have to have an intention in the game. That's something that comes from the word use in the human mind. When we're making mistakes, you're kind of like saying, oh, that was not a mistake, that's an accident type of thing, right? So you want to have like an intention that went amiss, but it's not necessary for language. I just wanted to clarify that, because it's always a bit of a language issue.
That's a very good point. Yeah, we want us to be really careful not trying to smuggling intentionality in there. But I can see, like, if we stick just to the setting an appropriate response after the fact, we don't have to bring intentionality in it. But I think even for the first part, we could just think of the sender part as a minimal biological agent that kind of just, given the state of the world, there's a bowl of urns and it randomly picks a signal, and then by the response being either successful for the organism survives or doesn't survive, it will continue doing this and have more of the same color balls in the same urn, or it will change, or in the evolutionary transition, how these urns are composited. So I think there's ways also to describe that without intentionality, just saying, it's also completely arbitrary at this stage, right? So like if we have just black and white balls in this urn, it's danger, not danger. Is it black or white? It's irrelevant. It just needs one signal for one response, and it can be completely random which one gets selected in a certain system.
Yeah, just to say that we, and Jonathan may wish to speak to this possibly. I mean, you know, one of the ways we kind of came to the whole mistake theory is through the thought that, well, you know, if you just look at it in terms of physics, without wanting to get too deeply into the whole physicalism, reductionism thing, but it is part of our kind of overall perspective, which is non-reductionist. But, you know, one variation is as good as another, if you like. For the antibody to act in this way rather than that way, from the point of view of physics or just pure chemistry, is neither here nor there. What really, you know, the rubber hits the road when you start looking at what the consequences are for the system as a whole and how it functions in its environment, whether it gets on well as a result. And, you know, autoimmune diseases and immune failures are the kinds of variations in the system which have terrible consequences. And, you know, timely and efficient protection against, you know, the enemy invader is what helps the system get on extremely well. So, and that, you know, but the physics won't tell you that. You know, you can stare at the physics as much as you like, and you can stare at a bunch of equations as much as you like, but it's not going to tell you why some variations have a kind of privileged status in the sense that they promote the well-being of the system. But that, on the one hand, which seems to us to be a real phenomenon, but on the other hand, you know, you were saying, well, maybe, you know, with antibody responses, maybe, you know, I don't know, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I got the feeling you were saying, well, you know, we can't necessarily say that it's not just metaphorical. So again, I struggle with the language that's used and the role of metaphor versus literal thinking. I mean, how could an immunologist talk about antibodies being fooled or deceived by pathogens, which they routinely can be, without using that kind of language, that normative language of deception and correct identification and misidentification? If you wanted to scrap that and just say it's a kind of useful heuristic to help us understand, but it really doesn't get you to the heart of the matter, I don't know how would you describe it in a way that really captured the phenomena? Do you see? Is that a legitimate worry from your?
Absolutely, yes. Probably the most frequent way I've heard and encountered in literature is when people say, especially with antibodies, that they would be recognizing their targets. And in a way, you can say they just mean innocently, oh, it binds the target. It's complementary, and there is this binding properties. But recognition says a bit more than that, right? Like there's already indication recognizing it as something, and not just it binds and triggers a signal and then there will be a response. But maybe that's what they mean, and say that's a practical shorthand to say it's like a probe that will allow us to detect and recognize, and if it fails to do so, it's being fooled, and we don't know the exact mechanisms behind these cells in the pathway they come afterwards. So we just use it as a shorthand to say the antibody would recognize or fail to do so, even though we all know that the recognition happens afterwards, when whether or not an appropriate response will be triggered or won't be triggered. But the antibody by itself is either just it's binding or not binding, with higher affinity, with lower affinity. Probably, if cornered, I would say that immunologists would try to say we use it as a shorthand in this kind of way, would be my impression.
Christopher, do you want to come?
Christopher.
Yeah,
go on. I'm not. You go on. You're following the rules.
We've got following the yellow hands.
Well, I was just going to say something on this topic, actually. I mean, I'm curious, and it interests me with respect to immunology, where we get that kind of goal that we're eventually reaching. So the goal is obviously like health or returning balance to the system in some way, right? And to me, when you talked about, a natural place one might see a kind of intentionality, however naturalized or whatever, is in signal processing. That I can see because signals can fail to be communicated, etc. But they don't have, at least as far as I can tell, and maybe I'm wrong in the specifics here, they don't have this sort of like goal state they're trying to reach, right? I mean, you can do all the information processing you want between signal A and receiver B, but there's no sort of like higher order, oh yeah, this should be the state of the system at the end of this process. And I wondered whether or not that end state is seen as something significant in immunology, or is it seen as something like to wave away and ultimately it reduces to something else?
That's a fascinating question. Like, what would be the end state, the desire that is supposed to be maintained? Like the standard view would again be to say like it's the defense against external threats by pathogens, or more general to maintain, well, homeostasis opens a whole nother can of worms, but to like maintain the integrity of an organism and its identity would probably be the most general way to describe it. Like Alfred Tauber and other philosophers of immunology would use that phrase to like establishing and maintaining the integrity and identity of an organism. But that's not, it's not one state really. It's also then in response from internal or external threats and changes where once an identity has been established, to keep it not just in a steady state, but to, if there is sudden changes, to mitigate them, if there's external threats, to deal with those. And probably that would be the end state here, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, obviously the end state wouldn't be something simple. It's not as simple as like the health. I mean, even the word homeostasis, it's not just reaching I mean, it's an extremely complex, multi-part. I mean, it doesn't make sense to think of it as one sort of single thing. It's a dynamic thing. But that being said, yeah, I guess I'm just curious whether or not that is viewed as something real in a sense, like if that is taken as some kind, you spoke about the integrity of and it as an individual. So is it just about like the compositional togetherness of an, as long as the thing isn't fading away or getting eaten away or something, or is there something, more robust there that maybe immunologists are working with, this concept of, the thing it's supposed to be, or the shape it's supposed to be, or the function it's supposed to do, or something that is maybe hidden in the language, or not? Is it, or is that something that's often just sort of, well, we know sort of prima facie what that means, and we know it's just a shorthand for not falling apart? Or
interesting question. Absolutely. Yeah, unfortunately the paradigm view of the immunity is all about defense against pathogens is still so much widespread that most people would just leave it at that, and they would probably also ask these questions like all this philosophical talk about integrity and identity, like we can't grasp this really, like how should we make this more concrete? But it shows in so many phenomena where it's not just external threats, but also trade-offs within the maintenance of an organism, keeping its components together and functioning, where when the immune system has to decide, for example, whether or not to kill a particular cell that shows behavior that's alarming for whatever reason, immediately getting rid of this particular cell at the danger of having not enough cells left in the tissue, or letting it divide uncontrollably with the danger of developing cancer, or just not knowing exactly what's going on. So what's part of this establishing and maintaining of integrity and identity are all sorts of housekeeping activities, and just observing what's going on, what entities and activities are there, and are they normal enough to not trigger an immune response in a way.
But that what you've just said seems to me to be to help capture what we think is not metaphorical, which is that these systems have to either act or not act, and action has to be directed one way or another. And that I think we would argue, well, that's the sort of irreducible criterion, and I was looking at your paper on the recent one on immunity and talking about context and regulation, and I was wondering, well, if we layer this go, no go, get it right, get it wrong in terms of activating and being directed to this rather than that, into that, does that coincide with your concepts of context and regulation, or is it a different sort of consideration?
I think it fits quite well. Also, when reading through your papers, I was also often marking, oh, here, context, trade-offs, regulation, and not just the keywords right there, but exactly the way of thinking, where that's very much in parallel here, I think.
Because I think, so to my mind, if one starts with action and acting or not acting, go, no go, as the sort of core, then everything else gets tested against that. So if you took, and this goes back to David's point, if you took variations in binding of antigens to antibodies, you can have huge amounts, potentially anyway, of variability in the binding. If it doesn't affect that action sort of equation, then it's just a physical variation.
Right.
So you can't get it out of the binding. You have to say, what difference does the binding make? Maybe a small difference in binding makes a big difference in the action go, no go, or the direction of it, or a large difference doesn't affect it at all. So I think we would say, well, the physics of it, for example, the binding pulls away from this criterion of action in relation to the environment of the immune system.
Exactly, I think so. Also, thanks for bringing it on the point again back to the action non-action part. This is also where we think in our paper we when criticizing the mainstream view of immunity, that it also fails to capture what happens when the immune system fails, is exactly this idea when the mindset is the immune system is merely a defense mechanism against pathogens, then we justifiably ask, well, why did it then react against the own body tissue in autoimmune diseases, or why does it respond and act against harmless, like peanuts when someone is allergic? And if we phrase it more in this terms of regulation and context, the mistake would be to these things just saying from an anthropomorphic perspective, whereas the decision whether or not to act or has been probably based more on how the immune system was shaped through evolutionary priming. Like that is just a speculation at this point, this so-called hygiene hypothesis, and this is not at all consensus. But if we take that for granted, for the sake of the argument, and would say the fact we have so many allergies right now is because we used to be exposed to a lot of helminths and worms, like parasites, multicellular parasites. And now that we live in very hygienic conditions, the environment has changed to such a degree, we are hardly ever exposed to worms, unlike the poor case where there was this large worm in the brain of a woman lately that made large media attention. That now the immune system would be overreacting, and even in the absence of any threat of this multicellular nature, it would then kind of start to overact on harmless particles like peanuts or other allergens. This is not really consensus, but it's a popular hypothesis, and that could show where such a change in the environment, whether or not you are frequently encountering certain pathogens, the response that used to be pretty much fine-tuned in such a way that it worked, apparently. And now in this hygienic environment, it wouldn't work so good anymore and would trigger responses in the absence of any real threats. So that's also what I really liked about your approach, that the environment plays such an important role to specify exactly in what context we want to say that, like, take a human from today back into the old environment where encountering such parasites was a frequent basis. The immune system's tendency to react this way would probably be much more appropriate. And that makes it very fascinating to see also how adaptations change, and this action or not action can be properly correct in one environment and then become a mistake when the environment or the organism changes drastically.
Ingo.
I always do it. I just want to briefly come back to a question of the integrity of the organism and the individuality, and that as a goal set, because it seems to me that even if you use language like trade-off or context dependent, or maybe it used to be appropriate once, now it's not. And all these, whenever you say these things, trade-off towards what end? You don't trade off unless there is something that you want, more money or more power, or in this case, something better integrity, more health, something. If it was appropriate once, in what sense was it appropriate then? And you immediately start defining it as you speak, saying, well, back then it defended against all these parasites. So you cannot really avoid, I think, this kind of goal setting. And if it's not explicit, then it's like the old definition of porn, right? It's porn. I know it when I see it. That was actually used in the legal context at one point in America because they couldn't really define it. But I think that's what is a little bit behind all this. You can't kind of escape, and it doesn't really matter. It pops up every time, and I think that's a very important aspect. And for me, it makes the big difference in terms of, like, for example, mechanisms. Like if you're talking about binding of antibodies, there is no question. And in some sense, that's just a mechanism. It's just a thing. It's a complicated biochemical sub thing, but it's in something, it's just a thing doing a thing. So if you just look at that level, it means nothing in some sense, but it means a lot to you. And all this metaphorical flowery language of, oh, it's got deceived and things, it comes all from this thinking about it tries to do something. And that's, I think, a very important point that shouldn't get lost. And in some sense, it's almost like a debt owed to the field, that you get clearer, I think, about what that is and what you're talking about. And if it's not the conventional one, then it is something, but that something is behind more or less everything you say, also in this more complicated picture, I think. Would be my comment to that.
Yeah, so like we can't escape the curse of teleology, or maybe it's not even the curse at all, because we can talk about it in meaningful ways and spell out reasonable goals and not fall into the traps of, I don't know, backward causation or.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, this is a very fascinating discussion, and I've already made a note of about 4 different things I wanted to say, and I'm probably not going to be able to say them all. But one thing is, going back to, again, the question that Christopher raised about goal and end state. So Thomas Perdue, of course, who is you've worked with, is famous for his immunological theory of the self. And I think that whatever one thinks about the overall metaphysics of that, whether you construct a whole theory of the self based on the immune system, which I'm a bit skeptical about, nevertheless, what's important, I think one of the things that's important about it is that it gives you a structure within which you can enunciate what this end state is, right? If the immune system, it's a subsystem for a start, right? It's not an organism. It's not a set of organisms. It's not a superorganism. It is technically a subsystem of a larger system, namely an organismic system. So you can't even begin to understand what the immune system does unless you understand that it is a subsystem, and as a subsystem, it must be doing something to subserve or to work in some way towards some end state of the system that it's a subsystem of. Now, if you think of immunity is being defined by, self and non-self type distinctions, then you can bring that right on board and say, well, look, if the system, the subsystem is subserving is a kind of self, the organismic self, then the end states are going to be self-directed end states. They're, the immune system is working towards the achievement of certain end states of the self, not itself, but of the self that it's serving. And then you can say, well, the properties are things like integrity and health and good action and in its environment, etc., and you can make those as biologically precise as you like. But I mean, I think what Thomas has done with that, I think, makes it more clear how you can show that relation between the subsystem and the system as a self. Do you think that kind of helps to demystify a little bit of this talk of end states and so on?
Exactly. I think that's a very good way to put it. Yeah.
Sorry, and other people can feel free to put up a hand and jump in. I'm just going to ramble a bit. So another thing that occurred to me is learning. So, and we non-experts think when we learn about a little bit about immunity and antibodies and so on, and the the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system, we one of the first things we find out about is that the systems learn. And they're trainable. And vaccination is a way of training the immune system, as is selective exposure to various pathogens and so on. So it seems to me that learning, where a system is capable of learning, then there must be mistake making, because otherwise, what are they learning, or what are they learning from, if not mistakes? So do you think that the phenomenon of learning, if we don't take that to be metaphorical, and it seems to me, I don't see how it can be anything other than literal. Otherwise, what is it that the system is doing when it's trained by, say, immunization or whatever to act in a certain way? If it's not learning, what is it doing? That if this learning is real, then the mistake making that the learning is connected to must also be real. Or am I taking it too far?
That's an interesting question. So once again, like talking about immune memory and learning comes with metaphorical caveats in a way, but it's still fitting some very general properties of any system that's capable in whatever loose sense of learning, that we don't have to think too much in analogy to human learning. With regards to mistake making, I was thinking about one phenomenon immediately came to mind, but I'm not sure if it perfectly fits it. So it's this so-called antigenic original sin, where if an organism is exposed to a certain antigen and it starts building immunity towards this, and then it's not, let's say this first exposition was not a real threat, and then as a different threat comes along that looks very similar, but is still different enough to have different effects. But the immune system will say, oh, that looks very similar to what I already know. I will not bother making new antibodies now, even though the ones I already have are ineffective against this slightly different one. And then it fails to defend if the new threat was a danger at all. In a way, you have, that would be probably more of a contextual thing, something that's harmless or not, and how this works. But that was the first idea I had now with regards to how memory and learning could probably be a mistake in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, original antigenic sin is quite interesting, isn't it? Apparently, well, there is if I'm wrong, I thought there was a theory going around that explains why it is that in the Spanish flu of 1918, well, the so-called Spanish flu of the global influenza of 1918, it overwhelmingly knocked out younger people within younger age brackets, and people in older age brackets actually tended to survive because they had been exposed to a prior flu which was sufficiently similar, but the ones who were caught hadn't been. So maybe I'm garbling that a little bit, but I've heard of original antigenic sin used in that context. So So you get the right kind of training, or you don't get the right kind of training. If you don't get the right kind of training, then the learning itself can be a mistake. I mean, if I make a mistake, again, it's always dangerous. The human case is disanalogous, obviously, but if I make a mistake in mathematics, and then I'm taught the wrong way to correct it, then I'm learning in the wrong way, and so I'm going to make another kind of mistake, or the same mistake, or whatever. So even the learning itself is can be a second order mistake if it's not itself done in the correct way. So anyway, that was just a thought. Ingo, you've got a hand up.
Right.
Never learn. So lots of mistakes on the muting. Just wanted to briefly say, in terms of learning, since we're now in the age of machine learning, which is kind of like a metaphor in action, if you like, there's like properties you could look at, like, for example, how many different things can you keep in mind at the same time, right? When do you confuse what is more likely to confuse the system? What is like too similar? What is too far? So there's, like, if you like, very objective criteria on how you can break down whether a system actually learns patterns, how many it can store. There's a whole apparatus for doing information analysis on that sort of thing. So I'm just saying, we don't need to talk about it necessarily in the sense of a cognitive thing, or at least not more cognitive than a neural network or artificial neural network is, right? So it could be quite at that level where you could pitch and say, well, I'm just doing a learning analysis on the immune system. I would be really curious if that has been done, if somebody is working on kind of just how many patterns can you put into, let's say, the human immune system before it breaks under the strain and just starts to forget, for example. Now, I can't remember the strain from 20 years ago because I've had to deal with 1,000 others, and they're just overriding the patterns that I'm working on, type of thing. So I think you could make a very nice analogy at this more technical level, if that makes sense. If it hasn't been done, I'm sure somebody has done things like that.
Yeah, it's a fascinating idea. And probably there's a factual learning limit, for example, like the phenomenon of T-cell exhaustion, that at some point there is not enough material that can be variably used to create different kind of T-cells, in addition to the antigenic sin effects. But yeah, that's a fascinating. I would love to see paper. Maybe they already exist. I'm with all the.
It seems like a good idea. It seems like a pretty straightforward idea, actually.
Just to say really quickly
what experimental data is like.
Just to say very quickly, one of the categories of mistake that we talk about in our papers is what we call unavoidable mistakes. So not every mistake can be learned from. Not every mistake is correctable, and there are examples that we give in that in our papers. And it may be that if T-cell exhaustion is a case of a kind of exhausted memory or something like that, that could be a kind of unavoidable mistake. It could be, if the system is overloaded or gets to a point where it can no longer respond correctly, then it will respond incorrectly and it will make a mistake, but it's not a mistake that anyone would want to waste their time trying to correct if the exhaustion was a real thing, if it was the sort of thing that you'd have to, maybe if you could genetically engineer things to fix it. But, in the normal run of things, no amount of immunization or no amount of exposure or no amount of, taking supplements is going to fix that problem. If the cells are exhausted, they don't have, the memory capacity for any new exposures, then it's an unavoidable mistake and you might have to just manage it and live with it. And so it seems that unavoidable mistakes might carry over even to that level.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Jonathan.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Mute. You're mute.
There
we go.
Ingo. You referred to the similarity of a antigen, and that seems to me that this is a critical point, and that mistakes become possible where systems function on the basis of similarities and differences, and the similarities are, as it were, system specific. So there could be a very small difference that the system takes to be important to action or not, and large differences that they don't. And seems to me the notion of learning includes the idea that the system can alter its criteria for similarity or can add criteria. So it might go in response to criterion A, and then add a second criterion, which one could call learning, so that it only goes if A and B are present. So the degree of similarity is not given by the physical state of the object and the environment, but rather what the system's giving priority to, and those priorities can change.
Right, and you have this kind of logical gates where different inputs would then be used to see, compare, make comparison, make decisions, and you cannot just say it's the physical state that's the decision-making factor.
Yeah.
A couple of things. One is a theme of what we're doing with the Mistakes Project is this kind of Aristotelian idea that, you know, systems have to, in order to maintain their well-being and their integrity and health and their reproducibility and so on, that they need to act in the right way at the right time for the right, you know, in the right conditions, in the right environment, just to the right amount, and not too early and not too late. You know, everything's got to be just right. And it seems the immune system is a kind of paradigm example of that. So, for example, you know, immune overreaction. So, you know, immune autoimmune diseases are a kind of overreaction, or can be, like a cytokine storm or something like that, where the system is just overreacting, and you get inflammation and all sorts of terrible things happen to you. And that for us would be a classic mistake. It's a mistake to overreact, because the immune system should be primed to react, but not too much, and not for too long, and not to too, you know, et cetera, and that the quality of the reaction by the immune system has to be right. You know, it's not just, I guess this goes back a little bit to binding, you know, and, well, you know, binding to this degree, binding to that degree, you know, who cares? It's just the same physico-chemically, but the quality of the reaction has to be right in order for the system to be considered to be working properly. So not overreacting, kicking in at the right time, and also terminating is a thing that we're quite interested in, because we're working on, Francois particularly, and Ingo, and our other team member John, working on blood flow. And, you know, that's got to be timely as well. Like when a blood clot forms, it's not enough that a clot forms, it's got to form at the right time, in the right place, and it's got to stop. And if it doesn't stop at the right time, you know, you get thrombosis and you die, right?
Right.
And the immune system has to know when to switch off. When to stop producing cytokines, or when to stop T cell activation or whatever. What is known about that? What is known, if anything, about how individual bits of the system, such as antibodies or killer cells or whatever, or whether the system as a whole, how it knows, you know, when to switch off?
That's a fascinating question. Yeah. So. Especially the point with overreacting was something also I had on my list to say, because that's often what actually is at the heart of a pathology. When even in case of an infection, what other kind of diseases, a lot of the symptoms, or what makes a patient suffer is often actually the immune system working or overreacting, and you give them immunosuppressants and things to get down the fever and all these things where you want to downregulate, where often it might be just because there's no better defense from the body perspective than to like fire at all with full forces, so to speak, to use this awful war metaphors, which I'm not a fan of. But yeah, this overreacting is a big issue, that downregulating and not just activating the immune system is really a crucial part. And I think we tend, because everything is so focused on, oh, you have this pathogen and dangerous threat, and the immune system gets activated, we tend to forget the other part of the story, that at least equally important is to like shut down things again. And the best way would also not think of the immune system as something that's dormant and only activated when there is a pathogenic threat, but really it's constantly active. It's constantly up and down regulating, trying to find the right balances, and if there were not enough of the down-regulating mechanisms at play, it would go completely haywire. And this exactly the point of not letting the system overreact, the immune system overreact, is really a crucial part. So that's one of the reasons behind the paper that Martin Sack and I wrote, that this notion of a strong immune system is so misleading on different fronts. One of which being that actually most of the cases you don't want a strong immune system. You don't want the immune system to overreact. You need to bring it down to a feasible level again.
But I think that's a really important point, because that's metaphorical talk. So it's almost like it's the metaphor of being a physical system, too strong, strong or weak. Whereas we're arguing the reverse. We're arguing that the non-metaphorical terms you need are the ones like completing an action, or down-regulating at the right time. And I think we'd say, well, that's not metaphorical at all. You can't describe an immune response or any other biological response without those sorts of terms.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. We need these terms to describe the system. Whereas the strong, weak, that's giving a misrepresentation that this is just a one-dimensional thing, and it can be on the scale 0 to 1 somewhere.
Like a force.
Ingo.
Yeah, so I was wondering, that's good, but what is actually doing the down-regulating? Is that, like, I mean, I've heard of positive feedback mechanisms that make your immune system explosively produce whatever, but what is it that actually turns it down? Is there anything other than, well, the pathogen has all been killed, there's lots of antibodies or whatever floating around now, not having nothing to do, and eventually they just die off because cells just have a certain lifetime, so then after a few days they maybe just die and then they're gone? Or is there anything, is there like literally in some sort of negative feedback mechanism, or a regulator, or some level of interaction between parts? Is there a kind of detector that says, hey, job done, retract the forces? And what is that detector? What's the signal chain? If you're talking about signaling, is there some hormone or something released? So I'm kind of interested in if it's just passive, kind of like we send out our armies, they did their work, maybe they break some havoc before they're dead, but they fall over eventually, and then we're returning to normal? Or is there more of a real control mechanism here?
So I think that there is also this kind of negative feedback, like cytokines and other signal molecules. Like maybe you have some immune components as the first responders, and they will leave molecules behind that attract like the second line cells to then come in, clear the debris, and start repairing damage and wound healing. And then they release certain cytokines that then like tell all other like macrophages, you don't need to come here, there's nothing left to eat for you, no pathogens. I think there are these active regulating mechanisms with signal molecules and cytokines that do that actively, and then you can have them also as therapeutic interventions where you give signal molecules that tone down immune reactions locally, and I think, but to be honest, I haven't looked too much into the like down regulation aspects of immunity, because the main narratives always give so much attention to the up regulation, but it should be equally important.
In the platelet stuff that we're doing, it's the same thing. Everybody, coagulation, platelet accumulation, and so on. That's the big, like the blowing up is the real thing. And then if you ask them, well, yeah, that's nice, but how does it stop? It gets a little bit this or that, or maybe, but it's not very clear at all. It's kind of amusing, because if you often the consequence of a positive feedback mechanism that is unregulated can be disastrous, and very quickly disastrous. It's designed to blow up really quickly. So, I mean, if you have an explosion, you better have a way of controlling the explosion if you want to survive it. to some extent. So I think it's an interesting one that the negative feedback don't get so much press. I think they tend to be quite at least as important as the positive run up. But anyway, that's a different
I mean,
point. Maybe.
I agree.
From the point of view of, biological normativity, it's as important, I mean, the stopping is as important as the starting. And if you take biological kind of normativity, these concepts of, purpose and integrity and health and well-being and the flourishing of the system, and et cetera, if you take them seriously, then it's sort of kind of obvious that the stopping and the starting are on a par. And I find it surprising, I guess, as a philosopher, coming from a certain perspective, that there isn't as much attention. I mean, when we asked this question in original discussion about, well, how do we know about clot termination? It's like it kind of gets people scratching their heads because they think, well, I don't know. We don't know how and why. We know why it's important to terminate, but we don't know how it happens or what the process is. And yet it's so important. Why would you not be investigating that as much as you investigate, how the clot starts and so on? And I guess the same with the immune system. So, and this comes back to this general phenomenon of recognition and detection and monitoring and identification. And what if anything do we know about how, for example, antibodies detect self and non-self? So sure, it can't all be done in terms, to say, well, they bind to certain things and they don't bind to others is in a way just stating the same phenomenon again in different language. It's not really getting you any deeper from an explanatory point of view. I mean, signaling presupposes information, and information, that which is such, we all know, is such a difficult philosophical concept. Information is somehow conveyed to an antibody that now is the time to go into action. Is there any work being done, at the coalface, if you like, on this kind of thing, detection, what the detection actually is and how information is processed by antibodies, for example? Or do they just try and get around that and just talk about binding reactions?
I think that's receiving quite some attention, maybe not in the formal terms we would like to see as philosophers, and to properly use notions of information there and see how it fits, but it gets certainly thrown around a lot, the term of information here, and how they describe how binding in certain contexts will or will not trigger a response, or where often it's then explained with, you need second signals, like the binding is not enough, you would also need to find a signal from the environment indicating like the surrounding tissue has been damaged, and now because there is this antigen that's not familiar to anything that has been learned before, like anything stored elsewhere, if it were not in the context of damage or some danger, whatever, second signals, we have so many foreign particles in our gut, for example, in our skin, where there shouldn't be a reaction, there mustn't be a reaction, and how that informational process then works. It's a difficult thing that also really questions this self non-self dichotomy, where we have so many non-self where no immune response is triggered, and how the information processing then proceeds from the beyond the binding, with second signals and if downstream effectors. There's some stories to tell, but it's probably not very satisfactory from what kind of information is passed on, how it's processed, but intuitively it makes sense.
So can you correct me? I'm going to speak like a complete, the typical armchair philosopher here. So I'm just going to put forward a point of view and tell me that I don't understand what's going on here. So it seems to me that if one tries to explain recognition, for example, in terms of binding, that it's putting the cart before the horse, because the binding presupposes recognition in the first place. It's a bit like shaking hands, right? I'm going to shake hands with my friend, but I won't shake hands with my enemy. But the recognition is not constituted by the shaking of the hands. The shaking of the hands presupposes that I've recognized my friend rather than my enemy, and then I shake hands. Is binding like that, or is that just a completely just misunderstanding what's going on?
That's an interesting comparison, because also the binding, it tends to be very simplified in this kind of lock and key notion, whereas we have molecular recognition, like interactions, local binding with local dipoles all the time between all of kind of molecules, even if they don't fit like a glove onto a hand. You'll have just more stable and longer interactions. And in fact, if the binding is too strong and too static, it can actually fail to deliver a signal. Like if the antigen antibody bind is so firm that it cannot diffuse away at all, it gets stuck, that can hinder that any information will be transferred. You need also not a too loose binding that will just diffuse away immediately. So also there is a bit more nuance than just, oh, it fits like a lock into a key. You can't do that if the binding is just too short or permanent. So
that's interesting. So the binding has to be just right.
Exactly.
That's very much something that we would find a congenial way of talking. So I'm assuming that there's so much work that's not there's so much that people just don't understand about this, right? About what's actually going on when antibody detection takes place. Would that be a fair comment?
But I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Anyone?
I'm enjoying this immensely, but I'm going to have to go in a moment.
Well, I'm wondering.
How long are we planning to go on till?
Well, I was going at a maximum another 15 minutes, but I mean, I'm happy if everyone else is to bring our fascinating discussion to an end, unless there are any further comments that people would like to make, Greg, or anyone else on screen. Anyone?
I might just quickly add that you're not shaking hands with people because they're friends, David. That's originally a gesture to take care that the other person can't draw a weapon with their hand. That's what it's from. I'm not joking at all. It is actually constraining your weapon hand. That's why you shake hands. But okay.
To be honest, I'm not surprised. The folkloric origins of handshaking. I'm not surprised that that's true. Actually, is that an appropriately lighthearted note to end on? Or Gregor, is there anything that you wanted to say to us? I mean, we've really appreciated. I'm just worried about abusing your graciousness in talking to us. Is there anything that you wanted to maybe to parting comment that you wanted to say or to ask us about?
Yeah, maybe one final issue that you mentioned with unavoidable mistakes. I've been thinking about a lot with what I want to work on in the future, that is biological aging. I'm writing a big grant at the moment right now. There is also something that with this idea of aging being a kind of necessary evil, that systems fall apart, all the maintenance and repair mechanisms are never 100% effective. Even like the huge DNA repair accuracy that can keep the copying errors to a very small minimum are not 100% perfect. And at some point, an organism will make mistakes, will be defective, dysfunctional, and fall apart and age and ultimately die. So I was wondering how this modal aspect of like being unavoidable, being necessary or possible, if you have I'm sure this is also an interesting application case to think, are there mistakes when a system ages and accumulates, making like errors and defects? Is that something that could also fall into this scope of your mistake making project?
That's I mean, it's an interesting question, and it's come up on a number of different occasions. I mean, just speaking generally from my own perspective, I think yes, the kind of things that go wrong in aging are the kind of mistakes. So, for example, a person a person with dementia will make recognition mistakes or make memory recall mistakes. That kind of mistake would be a typical example, I think, of an unavoidable mistake. It's just in the nature of the person to be, aged at that particular time in that particular way, and that aging constitutively involves memory failures and so on. And so it would be crazy to try and train someone with Alzheimer's to have a better memory. I mean, I don't know much about it. Maybe there are certain things that can be done and there are drugs that can be given to improve the situation, but you wouldn't sit down with them and necessarily try and train them to remember better like you would train a child, because the gray matter or whatever it is it's disintegrating. So that would count as a kind of mistake. This came up a bit in a conference recently in Canada, where we were asked about things like, when you go gray when you're old as well. Well, is it a mistake to go gray? Well, going gray in itself is not a kind of action. It's something that happens to you for a start. It's not a thing that you do in a active sense. But in any case, it is a kind of it's a normal part of being alive, and in that sense, could be considered a mistaken way of being in certain contexts and not in others. It depends on what, again, the environment and that you're considering and the context that you're considering. So I think aging is a really interesting example where mistake making, probably mainly of unavoidable, would be worth looking into. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of like gray area, because mistake attribution has to do a lot with one's capacities as well, right? You don't sit a squirrel down in front of a book and say, well, look, he's failed and made him, he can't read, right? So it depends on your capacities pretty crucially. And, are you making a mistake when you no longer have the mental capacity to perform such functions? Maybe you did as a human once, but now you don't. And can you still call it a mistake if it's not really possible for you to do it? So it might fall into that area of unavoidable mistakes. But that close link is actually really important. And as you get the capacity diminishing, especially like, I don't know, telomeres and things with aging, that capacity is gone. Are we going to say they make a mistake? Well, it has to be to a certain standard, and plausibly more probably in the genes than the other case, the human case. But it is a really fascinating entry point into the discussion.
Just another slant on this is that I think that the capacity for mistake making is central to biological systems. So what you're basically saying, Gregor, is that the aging has to do with, or is linked to how hard biological systems have to work to detect and mitigate mistakes. So coming to whether mistakes are real from biological systems point of view, they certainly are. It would be odd to think of DNA error detection mechanisms as anything other than really that, rather than something else. And that would lead us to all sorts of other thoughts about what it is that a mistake-prone system is capable of doing. So the mistake proneness is inherent to the biological process. So this picking up on this aspect of aging, i.e., the work our bodies have to do to avoid mistakes, is key to this deterioration, as it were.
That's fascinating. Also to think that probably that was like the adaptive processes behind that were fine-tuned certain ways for a certain typical lifespan. And if we say that the immune system is no longer effectively removing cancer cells in organisms at the age of 80, perhaps we could also not really say that it was a mistake in how the immune system evolved and its capacity, because if the average lifespan used to be shorter, and behind the selective shadow, we couldn't say this is a mistake by the immune system to not be effective in detecting and removing cancer cells beyond a certain age, because it cannot be also 100% accurate for that long period of time. There is this inherent constraints also here.
I think we need to be a bit careful there with levels of description. I mean, Jonathan has just stated it towards the bottom end, right? So talking about genes doing copy mistake or not, is that an error for the organism above? But now I think you're going above the kind of individual to kind of a super individual or whatever species level. And it might be that for a species it's better if I die at 80, but I don't think it's good for me to die at 80. I'm quite happily live to 200, I must say. At least I'm saying that now. And partly the reason why I might not say that is because my body starts failing, right? And I don't believe for a second, actually, that you couldn't construct a biological body that lives for 200 years or even 300 years. Even at something as complex as a human, you can probably do it just with what's available biochemically, but it's not there. And I don't think it's not there because of the individual. I think it's because at the higher level, species or whatever it might be, this would not be an optimal thing for spreading around humans, right? It would not be as fast or something. I don't know. I've not. All I'm trying to say is there's levels here, and you kind of have to say at what level you're saying a mistake is being made. I think we can quite
Right.
clearly say allowing cancer is a mistake for my immune system at any point in my life, but it doesn't mean that it's a mistake in the sense of maybe that the immune system eventually failing at 80 is a problem. That might not be the same perspective if you go beyond me. And unfortunately, sometimes things have to go beyond me. That's tragedy. But
Yeah,
anyway,
excellent
I can
point
see
with the
that.
levels. You're
Yeah.
completely right. Yeah, and
Yeah.
also to keep in mind that we need some kind of biological agent to use your framework at all and to keep those levels apart. Absolutely, yeah, good point.
Okay, well that's maybe an appropriate place at which to end for the evening. You know, there's been a great discussion. I'm sure we could have gone on for another hour if we had to, because there are so many unexplored topics here and so on. But it's been great to get you know, thoughts from you, Gregor, on immunity and so on, because it is such a persistent thing that comes up in our work on mistakes, the immunity and immune system and so on. So getting some enlightenment from you, I think, has been incredibly beneficial, and we're going to, you know, follow up with some of your work. So do keep us in mind when you publish some new stuff. Let us know, because it'd be great to follow up on what you're working on. And thank you for taking the time to look at our work and to interact with us. It's been really, really beneficial.
Thanks so much. It's been fascinating interactions, and I hope it was helpful at all. Like, the immune system is such a complicated thing. I can understand hesitation for people to say too much or like, but yeah, it's been super fascinating, and I look forward to future interactions.
Thank you so much, Gregor.
Thank you
Really.
very
Thank
much.
you, Gregor.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay.
Have a good night.
Have a good night. Bye.